The biggest mistake a bully can make is assuming silence means weakness. The morning air over Redwood State Penitentiary carried the sharp scent of wet concrete as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the prison yard. Steel fences glowed faintly beneath the rising sky, while watchtowers stood motionless like silent guardians overlooking every inch of the compound. Hundreds of inmates shuffled through their assigned morning duties, their conversations blending into a dull murmur that echoed against aging brick walls. Some swept sidewalks. Others hauled maintenance equipment across the yard. Every movement followed routines repeated thousands of times before. In a place where predictability meant survival, even the smallest interruption could become the center of everyone's attention. Elias Brooks pushed an old broom across the damp pavement with slow, measured strokes. At 72 years old, the elderly black inmate looked completely out of place among the younger prisoners surrounding him. His gray hair peaked beneath a faded prison cap, and deep lines across his face hinted at decades of hardship rather than fear. His prison uniform hung loosely from his lean frame, making him appear even smaller than he truly was. Most inmates barely acknowledged his presence anymore. To them, he was simply another old man quietly counting down his remaining years behind bars. Yet there was something strangely composed about him. While others rushed through assignments hoping to avoid trouble, Elias never hurried. Every movement seemed deliberate, almost practiced, as though nothing inside these walls possessed the power to disturb his calm. A few older correctional officers had noticed it before, exchanging brief glances whenever he passed, but they never spoke about it aloud. Across the yard, another sound shattered the ordinary rhythm of the morning. Laughter erupted near the maintenance shed, followed by heavy footsteps crossing the pavement with unmistakable confidence. Derek Cole approached surrounded by several white inmates who followed him everywhere like shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the permanent grin of someone accustomed to getting his way, Derek had spent years building a reputation that discouraged anyone from challenging him. Wherever he walked, conversations quieted. Wherever he stopped, people watched. Not because they admired him, but because nobody wanted to become the next target of his relentless humiliation. Derek's eyes settled on Elias almost instantly. He slowed his pace, smirking as though he'd just discovered the perfect source of entertainment to brighten an otherwise ordinary morning. One of his followers nudged another and pointed toward the elderly inmate, already anticipating whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Nearby prisoners subtly shifted positions, pretending to continue working while secretly keeping Derek within sight. Experience had taught them that mornings like this rarely ended quietly. Elias continued sweeping without lifting his eyes. The steady scrape of the broom across concrete never changed its rhythm. Even as Derek stepped closer, his boots splashing through shallow puddles left behind by the overnight cleaning crew. Somewhere above them, a lone security camera rotated slowly toward the gathering crowd, capturing every silent second before something happened that would leave the entire prison questioning whether appearances had fooled them all from the very beginning. Derek stopped only a few feet away, folding his arms while his friends spread out behind him with the confidence of people who believe the entire yard belonged to them. Conversations faded one by one until only the distant buzz of security gates and the steady scrape of Elias's broom could be heard. The old man never looked up. He simply continued clearing the thin layer of leaves and dust that the morning wind had scattered across the walkway. Derek tilted his head, almost disappointed that his arrival had failed to produce even the smallest reaction. "You deaf, old man," he called loudly enough for nearby inmates to hear. A few nervous chuckles drifted through the crowd. Nobody answered. Elias calmly pushed another line of debris toward the edge of the sidewalk, his breathing slow and even. The silence seemed to irritate Derek far more than an argument ever could. He took another step closer until his shadow stretched across the broom handle. "I asked you a question." Still nothing. Several inmates exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen countless newcomers panic when Derek singled them out, but this felt different. It was not defiance. It was not fear either. It was something much harder to explain. Elias finally paused his sweeping, lifted the broom slightly, and quietly moved around Derek without making eye contact, as though the larger man were simply another object standing in the middle of the walkway. The gesture was so ordinary that it somehow felt more insulting than any spoken response. Derek's smile disappeared. His followers stopped laughing. One younger inmate whispered under his breath, wondering whether the old man truly understood whose path he had just ignored. High above the yard, Officer Ryan Mercer watched through reinforced glass from the observation platform. He had worked at Redwood State Penitentiary for nearly 18 years and had learned to recognize the warning signs that often appeared before trouble started. Surprisingly, his attention was not fixed on Derek. It remained on Elias. Mercer quietly remembered processing the elderly inmate several months earlier. Most correctional officers had dismissed him after reading a thin intake file containing very little information beyond his age and sentence. Yet Mercer still remembered one detail that had never made sense. During the medical evaluation, the prison physician had noted unusually fast reflexes for a man in his 70s. The observation had been buried beneath routine paperwork and forgotten almost immediately. Mercer had not forgotten. Down below, Derek slowly circled back in front of Elias once again. This time he reached toward a maintenance cart parked beside the sidewalk where a long industrial water hose remained connected after the morning cleanup. He casually wrapped one hand around the nozzle while flashing another confident grin toward the growing audience. Around them, more inmates quietly drifted closer under the excuse of carrying tools or collecting supplies. Even several correctional officers found themselves watching from a distance. Nobody seemed eager to interrupt what looked like another harmless display of intimidation. Elias rested both hands on the broom handle and looked across the yard for the first time that morning. His eyes briefly settled on the rows of fences, the watchtower beyond them, and the pale morning sky above the razor wire before returning to the concrete beneath his feet. His expression never changed, but somewhere inside the crowd an older inmate lowered his voice and quietly murmured, "Some storms begin with thunder. The dangerous ones begin with silence." The moment Derek tightened his grip around the hose nozzle, a quiet wave of anticipation rolled across the prison yard. Men who had spent years pretending not to notice other people's problems suddenly found reasons to slow their work. A maintenance crew paused beside a chain-link fence. Kitchen workers carrying empty food containers lingered near the loading dock. Even inmates assigned to the opposite side of the yard angled their heads just enough to keep the gathering within view. Redwood State Penitentiary had developed its own unspoken rules over decades. Official regulations were printed in thick manuals, but everyone knew the real rules lived inside daily routines, silent understandings, and carefully measured displays of authority. Derek Cole had spent years shaping those invisible rules in his favor. He rarely needed to raise his voice because his reputation usually spoke first. New arrivals learned his name within hours. Older inmates avoided unnecessary eye contact. Many simply accepted that challenging him created more problems than remaining invisible. That was how order survived inside the walls. Yet this morning carried an unfamiliar feeling that several longtime prisoners could not quite explain. Elias Brooks did not behave like someone trying to avoid conflict. Neither did he carry himself like someone looking for one. There was an unusual balance in everything he did. While his shoulders appeared relaxed, his posture never collapsed. While his hands looked weathered with age, they never trembled. While his attention seemed fixed on the broom resting against the pavement, his eyes quietly reflected the movements of everyone nearby through windows, puddles, and polished metal surfaces scattered around the yard. Officer Ryan Mercer noticed the same details from above. Years earlier, before joining corrections, he had completed advanced defensive tactics training with instructors who constantly emphasized awareness over strength. Watching Elias now stirred memories he had not considered in a long time. It was not any single movement that caught his attention. It was the absence of wasted movement. Every shift of weight looked efficient. Every step ended in perfect balance. Mercer leaned slightly closer to the observation window without realizing it. Down below, Derek casually dragged several feet of hose across the concrete, allowing the rubber line to scrape loudly against the ground. His followers laughed as though the sound itself had become part of the performance. One inmate quietly muttered that the old man would probably spend the rest of the morning soaked from head to toe. Another inmate answered with a nervous shrug, saying the elderly prisoner should have simply apologized when he had the chance. Not everyone agreed. An older prisoner named Leonard Hayes watched from the edge of the crowd with narrowed eyes. Leonard had served more than 25 years inside different state facilities and trusted instincts that experience had sharpened. He quietly studied Elias for another few seconds before whispering almost to himself, "That is not the face of a man waiting for mercy. That is the face of someone waiting for the right moment." The words disappeared beneath the steady hum of the yard before anyone else seemed to notice, but Officer Mercer happened to glance toward Leonard at the exact same moment. For reasons he could not explain, both men reached the same silent conclusion. They were no longer watching an ordinary confrontation between a prison bully and an elderly inmate. They were watching the first few moments of a story that nobody inside Redwood State Penitentiary would ever forget. The yard remained unusually quiet as Derek rested the hose across one shoulder, enjoying the attention that followed him wherever he went. He believed he controlled the pace of every encounter, but the man standing before him seemed completely untouched by the invisible pressure surrounding the moment. Elias Brooks gently leaned the broom against the maintenance cart before folding his weathered hands in front of him. He did not cross his arms. He did not clench his fists. He simply stood with the kind of relaxed posture that looked ordinary until someone paid close attention. Officer Ryan Mercer continued watching through the observation window, unable to ignore a growing feeling that something about the elderly inmate refused to fit the picture everyone else had already accepted. Most prisoners carried tension in their shoulders or stiffness in their necks after months behind bars. Elias carried neither. His breathing remained slow and perfectly measured, almost synchronized with the gentle morning breeze moving across the yard. Mercer quietly remembered another detail from intake processing. While several officers struggled to fingerprint new arrivals because of nervous shaking or emotional stress, Elias had stood completely still for nearly 10 minutes without shifting his weight once. At the time, everyone assumed it was simple patience. Now Mercer was no longer certain. Across the yard, Leonard Hayes kept studying the older man with increasing curiosity. Years ago, before prison became his permanent address, Leonard had spent weekends taking boxing lessons at a neighborhood recreation center outside Cleveland. He had never become a fighter, but he remembered one lesson that his instructor repeated every Saturday morning. Real confidence never announced itself. It appeared in balance, breathing, and discipline long before anyone threw a single punch. Looking at Elias now, Leonard could not shake that memory. The old man's shoes remained planted naturally on the pavement, neither too close together nor too far apart. His shoulders stayed loose while his eyes quietly observed everything happening around him without appearing to stare at anyone directly. It reminded Leonard less of an inmate and more of someone who had spent decades teaching control rather than seeking attention. Nearby, a young inmate named Carlos frowned with confusion. He had shared maintenance duty with Elias several times over the previous month. The old man rarely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. Every morning, he finished his assigned work early, then quietly helped slower inmates without expecting thanks. Once, Carlos accidentally dropped a heavy toolbox while repairing a damaged fence. Before it struck the ground, Elias had caught it with surprising speed, smiling gently before handing it back as though nothing unusual had happened. Carlos had laughed about it at the time, assuming luck explained everything. Remembering it now, he wondered whether luck had anything to do with it at all. Derek noticed none of these quiet observations unfolding around him. His attention remained fixed on the audience gathering across the yard, feeding the confidence that had carried him through years of intimidation. The larger the crowd became, the more certain he felt that this morning would strengthen his reputation once again. Elias slowly lifted his eyes for only a moment, meeting Derek's gaze without anger, fear, or resentment. There was only calm, the kind of calm that often belongs to people who have already faced challenges far greater than the one standing directly in front of them. Several inmates later admitted they felt something shift in that silent exchange, although none of them could explain exactly what they had seen. It lasted less than 2 seconds, yet somehow it made the growing crowd even quieter than before. Derek slowly turned the brass valve attached to the industrial hose until a low hiss escaped through the nozzle. The sound alone was enough to pull every nearby set of eyes toward him. Water pressure built steadily inside the thick rubber line, causing it to twitch gently against the concrete. Derek smiled without taking his eyes off Elias. "You know what your problem is?" he asked loudly. "You keep acting like you were somewhere else." A few of his followers laughed on cue, while others waited to see how the old inmate would respond. Elias simply lowered his gaze toward the broom, leaning beside the maintenance cart. "I am exactly where I need to be," he answered quietly. His voice was calm, respectful, and carried no trace of sarcasm. The simple reply only deepened Derek's irritation. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Wrong answer," Derek replied. Without warning, he aimed the hose downward and released a brief stream of water that splashed across the pavement directly in front of Elias's worn work boots. Cold water spread across the concrete, soaking the edge of the elderly man's pant leg. More laughter echoed through the yard. Several younger inmates looked away, uncomfortable with the scene but unwilling to intervene. Elias did nothing except take one small step backward to avoid standing in the growing puddle. His breathing never changed. His expression remained as peaceful as it had been all morning. Derek shook his head in disbelief. "Still nothing?" he mocked. "I expected at least a complaint." Instead of answering, Elias quietly picked up the broom and continued clearing wet leaves toward a nearby drain as though the interruption had never happened. The crowd exchanged puzzled looks. Some expected anger. Others expected fear. Nobody expected complete composure. Derek frowned, feeling the attention of the yard beginning to shift in a direction he did not like. He turned the hose again, sending another controlled burst of water across the walkway, this time scattering leaves that Elias had already collected into a neat pile. The old inmate watched the leaves drift away before calmly beginning the task again from the beginning. Not a sigh escaped him. Not a single irritated glance. Leonard Hayes folded his arms while watching from several yards away. "He is making Derek work harder than he realizes," Leonard quietly muttered. Carlos looked confused. "He is just cleaning the same spot again." Leonard slowly shook his head. "No. Derek wants a reaction. Every second he does not get one, he loses a little more control." Above them, Officer Mercer noticed exactly the same thing. The yard had become strangely divided. At first, everyone had been watching Derek. Now more and more eyes rested on Elias instead. People were no longer asking what the bully might do next. They were wondering why. The elderly inmate refused to play the role everyone expected. Derek sensed the change almost immediately. His grin faded as frustration replaced amusement. He tightened his grip around the hose, glancing briefly at the growing audience surrounding them. The performance that had begun as entertainment was no longer unfolding according to his script. For the first time in years, he found himself standing before someone he could not seem to provoke, intimidate, or even distract, and that quiet mystery unsettled him far more than any argument ever could. Derek slowly lowered the hose, but the smile that usually followed his public displays had completely vanished. Around him, the crowd had grown larger than he expected. Correctional officers stood at distant checkpoints pretending to monitor routine activity, yet even they were paying closer attention than usual. Nobody understood why such a simple encounter had become impossible to ignore. Elias quietly rested the broom against his shoulder and resumed gathering the scattered leaves, almost as though the entire yard had disappeared around him. Every motion remained smooth, controlled, and economical. He never hurried. He never hesitated. Officer Ryan Mercer finally stepped away from the observation window and walked downstairs toward the administrative office. Something continued bothering him, and after nearly 2 decades inside Redwood State Penitentiary, he had learned never to ignore instincts that refused to fade. He entered the records room, greeted the clerk, and requested Elias Brooks's intake file. The clerk shrugged before sliding a thin folder across the counter. "There is almost nothing in there," she said. Mercer opened it anyway. Most of the pages contained routine information that every inmate file included. Medical clearance, housing assignment, work detail, behavioral evaluations. Yet one page near the back carried a small note written months earlier by Sergeant Nathan Collins, an officer who had retired shortly after Elias arrived. The note read, "Subject demonstrates exceptional body awareness and uncommon discipline. Observe before making assumptions." There was no explanation beneath the sentence, no additional report, and no recommendation. Mercer frowned. Collins had never been a man who wasted words. If he bothered writing a note at all, there had been a reason. Back in the yard, Leonard Hayes quietly stepped beside Carlos, while keeping his voice low enough that only the younger inmate could hear. Do you know why that old man never loses his balance? Carlos shook his head. Leonard smiled faintly. Because he is never standing where he cannot move from. Carlos looked toward Elias again. Now that Leonard had mentioned it, he noticed the elderly inmate always seemed perfectly centered no matter which direction he turned. Even while sweeping, his feet naturally settled into positions that allowed him to step smoothly without crossing or stumbling. It did not look rehearsed. It looked instinctive. Nearby, another older inmate named Walter Simmons quietly joined the conversation. Walter had spent years working as a janitor in county recreation centers before prison. He reminds me of somebody, Walter whispered. Years ago, I cleaned a sports arena in Detroit. One weekend, they hosted a regional kickboxing tournament. Those coaches never stopped watching foot placement. Even while standing still, they looked ready to move. Leonard slowly nodded without taking his eyes off Elias. Exactly. None of them claimed to know the old man's past, but tiny memories from completely different lives were beginning to connect in unexpected ways. Derek remained unaware of every quiet conversation unfolding around him. He saw only an old inmate refusing to react and a crowd waiting for him to regain control of the moment. Pride would not allow him to walk away. Every minute that passed without a response from Elias felt like another invisible challenge to the reputation he had spent years building. He wrapped both hands around the hose once more, drawing a slow breath as though convincing himself that one final display would restore the order everyone had always accepted. Across the yard, Officer Mercer returned outside carrying the thin folder under one arm, his eyes fixed on Elias with growing curiosity, increasingly convinced that the quietest man in Redwood State Penitentiary was also the one almost everyone had completely misunderstood. The breeze across the yard faded until even the flags above the administration building hung almost perfectly still. Derek slowly raised the industrial hose one last time, his jaw set with the stubborn confidence of someone who believed every confrontation could still be won through intimidation alone. Around him, conversations disappeared completely. Nobody laughed anymore. The mood had shifted from amusement to anticipation. Elias stood quietly beside the maintenance cart with one hand resting lightly on the broom handle. His eyes drifted across the concrete, briefly noticing the thin sheet of water spreading toward a nearby drain before returning to Derek. There was no anger in his expression, only patience. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped through the yard entrance carrying the thin personnel folder beneath one arm. He stopped several yards away, choosing not to interrupt what was unfolding. Something told him that stepping in too early might create more problems than allowing the moment to reveal itself. Derek mistook the silence for hesitation. "You finally paying attention?" he asked loudly. Elias answered with the same calm voice that had never risen all morning. "I have been paying attention from the beginning." The reply drew puzzled looks from several inmates. Derek laughed once, but the sound lacked its earlier confidence. He turned the valve, and another strong stream of water rushed from the nozzle, sweeping across the pavement toward Elias. Before anyone fully registered what happened next, the elderly inmate made one quiet movement. Instead of jumping backward or freezing in place, he shifted less than a single step to one side with remarkable timing, allowing the rushing water to pass harmlessly across the space where he had been standing only a heartbeat earlier. His movement looked so effortless that several inmates blinked, unsure whether they had actually seen him move at all. The water continued racing across the concrete until it splashed harmlessly against an empty maintenance barrel several feet away. Elias remained completely balanced, his shoes planted on dry pavement as though he had anticipated the exact path long before the hose had been raised. Derek frowned in confusion and instinctively adjusted the nozzle again, trying to follow him. Once more, Elias responded with another small step, smooth and precise, never rushing, never stumbling, never wasting motion. To the watching crowd, it resembled less of an escape and more of a carefully practiced exercise repeated countless times over many years. Leonard Hayes slowly exhaled. "That is footwork," he whispered. "Not luck." Walter Simmons nodded without taking his eyes off the scene. Carlos stared in disbelief, finally understanding why the old inmate always seemed perfectly balanced no matter where he stood. Above the murmurs spreading through the yard, Officer Mercer quietly remembered Sergeant Collins's handwritten note about uncommon discipline. Suddenly, the words carried far greater meaning than they had inside a filing cabinet. Derek lowered the nozzle for a brief second, genuinely confused for the first time that morning. His confidence had depended on predictable reactions, but nothing about Elias followed the pattern he understood. The elderly inmate never celebrated. He never smiled. He simply adjusted the broom against his shoulder and looked at Derek with quiet respect before saying, "Strength is not measured by how loudly a person demands attention. It is measured by how calmly they carry themselves when everyone else has already made the wrong judgment." No one answered. Across Redwood State Penitentiary, the silence that followed those words felt heavier than anything the crowd had experienced all morning. And for the first time, many of them began wondering who Elias Brooks had really been long before he ever walked through the prison gates. Officer Ryan Mercer slowly opened the folder once more while standing near the edge of the yard. The morning sun reflected across the plastic cover as he carefully turned another page that most officers had probably skipped without a second thought. Several handwritten notes appeared in faded blue ink beside standard intake forms. They had been added by Sergeant Nathan Collins during Elias Brooks's first week inside Redwood State Penitentiary. Collins had never been known for exaggeration. If anything, he usually wrote less than everyone else. Mercer quietly read the first note again. Exceptional discipline. The second note carried only 6 additional words. Movements consistent with advanced athletic training. There was still no explanation, no official background, no incident report, just observations from a veteran officer whose judgment had earned respect throughout the institution. Mercer looked up from the file and watched Elias standing peacefully beside the maintenance cart. The description suddenly seemed almost incomplete. Nearby, Leonard Hayes slowly approached Officer Mercer after receiving permission from another correctional officer. "Can I ask you something?" Leonard said quietly. Mercer nodded without taking his eyes off Elias. "Has anybody ever looked into what that old man did before prison?" Mercer answered honestly. "Not that I know of." Leonard glanced across the yard before lowering his voice even further. "Because I have spent enough years around fighters to recognize habits that never disappear." Mercer finally turned toward him. Leonard continued, "It is not how he moves when people are watching. It is how he moves when nobody thinks they are watching. He protects his balance without thinking about it. That kind of training takes decades." Mercer remained silent. Walter Simmons joined them a moment later. "Detroit," Walter said softly. "Many years ago I cleaned arenas after regional kickboxing events. Coaches used to walk exactly like that. Calm, relaxed, every step already prepared for the next one." Mercer slowly looked back toward the folder before opening the final page. Tucked inside was a newspaper clipping that had apparently been overlooked during processing. The paper had yellowed with age, but one photograph remained surprisingly clear. A much younger Elias Brooks stood inside a crowded sports arena wearing a championship jacket while raising the arm of another athlete after a title match. Across the top of the article appeared a headline that read, "Veteran trainer Elias Brooks leads 5th national kickboxing champion." Mercer felt his heartbeat quicken. The accompanying story described Elias as one of the most respected kickboxing instructors in the Midwest, a mentor who had trained amateur champions, professional competitors, and defensive tactics instructors for several law enforcement agencies over nearly 3 decades. The article praised his philosophy that true victory came from discipline, patience, and self-control long before physical skill. Mercer slowly lowered the clipping, suddenly understanding why Sergeant Collins had never rushed to judge the quiet inmate. Around the yard, whispers spread from one small group to another as fragments of the discovery reached curious ears. Carlos stared toward Elias with open disbelief. Walter quietly smiled to himself. Leonard simply nodded as though the final missing piece had finally fallen into place. Derek remained several yards away, still holding the hose, completely unaware that the man he had dismissed as a harmless elderly prisoner had spent much of his life teaching others the very skills that so many people had failed to recognize. For several long moments, nobody moved. The morning routine that normally governed every corner of Redwood State Penitentiary had quietly come to a standstill. Correctional officers exchanged brief looks without saying a word. Inmates who had gathered out of curiosity now found themselves staring at Elias Brooks with an entirely different kind of attention. The old man had not raised his voice, demanded respect, or attempted to impress anyone. Yet somehow he had earned more of it in a single morning than many people managed in years. Derek slowly released his grip on the hose until the nozzle rested against the damp concrete. The confidence that usually defined his presence had given way to something unfamiliar. It was not fear. It was uncertainty. For the first time since arriving at Redwood State Penitentiary, he realized he had judged another man entirely by appearances. Around him, even his closest followers seemed unusually quiet, unsure whether to continue standing beside him or quietly return to their assigned duties. Officer Ryan Mercer closed the personnel folder and walked toward Elias at an unhurried pace. When he reached the elderly inmate, he offered a small nod of professional respect. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I believe there is far more to your story than most of us understood." Elias returned the nod with the same calm expression he had worn since sunrise. "Every person has a story," he replied. "Most people simply stop listening after the first chapter." Mercer smiled faintly. It was the kind of answer that sounded simple until someone carried it with them for a while. Nearby, Leonard Hayes quietly repeated the sentence under his breath, knowing he would remember it long after this day ended. Word spread through the prison faster than anyone expected. By lunchtime, inmates in other housing units were already talking about the quiet elderly man who had remained composed while everyone else expected him to lose control. By evening count, the story had changed slightly with each retelling, but one detail never changed. Every version described Elias as a man who possessed remarkable discipline rather than remarkable strength. Somehow that made the story even more powerful. Over the following days, something subtle shifted inside the prison. Younger inmates began greeting Elias with quiet respect instead of indifference. Maintenance crews volunteered to help him finish assignments before returning to their own work. Even correctional officers who had barely noticed him before now paused to exchange polite conversation whenever their paths crossed. Elias accepted none of the attention as though it belonged to him. He continued sweeping walkways, helping others without being asked, and ending each day exactly as he had begun it, calm, patient, and unhurried. Derek watched those changes from a distance. Pride prevented him from approaching the elderly inmate again, yet curiosity refused to leave him alone. Every answer he thought he had about strength, respect, and leadership suddenly felt incomplete. One quiet afternoon, while work crews prepared to return inside, Derek noticed another inmate greeting Elias with the words, "Coach." Elias simply smiled before gently shaking his head, but the single word was enough to make Derek stop walking. He had believed the story was over. Instead, he was only beginning to understand that the greatest lessons inside Redwood State Penitentiary had never been taught through intimidation, but through quiet character that revealed itself only to those willing to look beyond appearances.